Brazil sees its deadliest day yet, with nearly 1,200 coronavirus deaths registered in the last 24 hours. Bolivia's Office of the Ombudsman calls for investigation into the de facto government's purchase of 170 ventilators for COVID-19 patients. And Palestine withdraws from all agreements with Israel and the United States. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Carla Gonzalez. Let's begin with Brazil. The country registered 1,179 coronavirus deaths in the past 24 hours. The health ministry announced it on Tuesday as the pandemic hits its worst daily toll in the hardest hit Latin American country. The overall death toll now stands at almost 18,000. New infections in the past 24 hours total over 17,000, bringing the total to over 271,000. Still, experts warn that the peak is not expected until early June. Brazil jumped from 6th to 3rd place in the world in number of infections, behind only to the US and Russia. The Office of the Ombudsman in Bolivia demanded the de facto government of Yanin Áñez to report the details of purchases of ventilators for COVID-19 patients. The Office of the Ombudsman requested the Ministries of Justice, Transparency, the Controller's Office, and the Legislative Assembly investigate and supervise the purchase of 170 ventilators. According to the institution, there is a lack of transparency in the information provided by authorities regarding the characteristics of the equipment purchased. Venezuela's Communications Minister Jorge Rodriguez said that more than 43,000 Venezuelans returned to the country from abroad, and that among them there are 407 who tested positive for COVID-19.
43,089 Venezuelans have returned, and of those, 407 have tested positive for COVID-19. Pay attention to the importance of this. Venezuela has now 749 cases. The cases coming from bordering countries represent almost 50% of the total cases reported. Almost 60% of the cases come from abroad. It is also important to say that at the moment there have been 253 patients recovered, representing 33.8% recovery rate, as we have 486 active cases.
El Salvador's Supreme Court has ordered the immediate suspension of the state of emergency declared by President Nayib Bukele over the coronavirus. It comes after the president extended coronavirus measures without approval by Congress, which was seen to be an unconstitutional move.
This not only lacks common sense, lacks empathy, lacks humanity, lacks logic, lacks legality, but they are also taking away powers from the executive to give them to the legislature.
Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno has announced new economic measures in order to mitigate the economic crisis brought upon by the COVID-19 pandemic. Among these is a $4 billion budget cut in public spending.
150,000 Ecuadorians have lost their jobs because companies have closed down. Ecuador has never experienced such a difficult situation due to the pandemic. Ecuador is losing $8 billion in revenues, and with the $4 billion deficit of the general state budget. This amounts to a total of $12 billion lost for the country. Since the beginning of my term, we have closed down the embassies of Algeria, Nigeria, Belarus, Ethiopia, and Angola. Now we will close down another 5 embassies, such as for the countries of Malaysia, Iran, and Nicaragua. And we also closed the offices of the representation of the International Civil Aviation Organization and the Secretary of the Andean Parliament.
That was what President Lenin Moreno said in a public statement. And our correspondent, Denise Herrera in Quito, has more about this.
The Ecuadorian government has introduced several economic reforms in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, President Lenin Moreno justifies a series of economic measures to cut the budget of the state. In this context, Moreno announced the implementation of a new cut in the public sector of more than $4,000 million, which will correspond to a reduction in the wage bill of $980 million goods and services for 100 million and capital expenditure 1,300 million. Moreno also announced that he will eliminate 7 public companies and he also will close some embassies and diplomatic offices. Moreno in this context said also that he is reducing 25% of the public employees' salaries. The government said that these economic reforms are taken to respond to the pandemic situation and to protect all citizens' rights. In this context, several organizations of workers and students have rejected these economic reforms. They said that Moreno is not thinking in the rights of the Ecuadorian citizens and that the government is protecting just the interests of the big companies in the country. Also, the Citizen Revolution movement announced that they will begin a new impeachment against the finance minister of Ecuador, Richard Martinez. They said that Martinez is not thinking in Ecuador, and these decisions came after the agreement with the IMF.
That was our correspondent, Denise Herrera. And Ecuador's National Assembly has approved 2 economic laws that would allegedly respond to the crisis caused by COVID-19. However, social organizations are mobilizing to reject these law projects as, according to them, they severely harm workers' rights.
The National Assembly has approved the so-called Humanitarian Assistance Law that permits individual agreements between employers and workers, including the reduction of salaries by up to 55%, total control of vacation time by employers, reduces Social Security contributions, among other issues. Lawmakers who voted in favor of the measure say they will protect jobs.
This is not a permanent law. It was created due to the current situation. When things go back to normal, we'll have to see how to regulate this law. But what we want to do is to decrease the number of layoffs and protect jobs.
Nonetheless, opposition lawmakers have warned this law severely violates workers' rights.
This law hurts workers. This law has absolutely nothing that makes it humanitarian. It may be humane to the elite, to tax havens, but it's the opposite to workers. Given how much this reverts many rights, our party will take this law to the Constitutional Court, so it can be deemed unconstitutional.
Across the country, worker and student unions mobilized to oppose these austerity measures, even demanding the immediate resignation of Finance Minister Richard Martinez.
We have called on social organizations to oppose these neoliberal austerity measures, which stand against the rights of workers as well as our children.
Students are once again on the streets to demand the resignation of the finance minister for his continued cuts to the education budget, despite the fact there's a ruling by the Constitutional Court that deems such budget cuts illegal. We also stand in solidarity with workers and reject these economic laws.
Various social and political organizations have suggested alternatives to confront the crisis, including special contributions by large economic groups or collecting overdue tax payments, which amount to around $1.5 billion. But the government has so far ignored most proposals.
We have more stories coming up. Don't go away. Welcome back. In Colombia, relatives and friends attended the Bureau of Environmental and Social leader Jorge Oramas after his assassination in the Cauca Valley.
We are in pain. The family is in pain. Everybody has felt the loss. I wanted to say so much about him, but right now all I can say is that Enrique was a marvelous man who was taken from us. We only wish for justice.
In Brazil, a community organization in Rio's Mare neighborhood has launched a new project to help those in need during the pandemic. Redes da Mare hires women from a domestic violence shelter to cook meals for favela citizens suffering from drug abuse.
After the COVID-19 lockdown forced closure of a catering service run by residents of a domestic violence shelter in Mare, a neighborhood of 16 favelas on Rio de Janeiro's north side, a local community organization hired them to cook meals for the neighborhood's chemical-dependent population.
Everything had to stop due to the pandemic, so we started a new project with the same quality and style of food for the local street dwellers. Every day, it's a totally different menu and it's good food.
Health officials recommend that in cases where social distancing is impossible, you get enough daily caloric intake to keep their immune system strong. For this reason, local residents decided to deliver meals to 2 areas where crack cocaine users congregate in their community.
We were thinking what we could do to support the local street dwellers' population resist this period of crisis. So we thought about their food security and hired the Maria de Sabor to produce 200 hot meals a day here in their industrial kitchen in the women's house.
Regis Damare says it will continue to hire the women to provide meals for as long as the lockdown continues. Brian Mir, Telesur, São Paulo.
Lesotho's prime minister has resigned, ending a months-long crisis that engulfed the kingdom after he was accused of playing a conspirational role in the murder of his estranged wife. Thomas Tabane and his then-wife, Lipolelo Tabane, were in the midst of a bitter divorce in 2017 when she was shot dead outside her home, 2 days before her husband's inauguration. After pressing evidence emerged on Tabane's link to the murder, the ruling party and the opposition forced him to step down and nominated Finance Minister Moeketsi Majoro to be his successor.
Well, I think the way that Dr. Thomas Tabane stepped down, I think it's quite unfortunate. I think he's someone that was revered in the political arena of Lesotho for the longest of times. I think he fell into the trap of most of our leaders that are there for a bit too long. I think he got older, he got more susceptible to influence, and I think that may have dented his image. But yeah, I think he served the country, but I think he served it maybe a bit too long.
One would love to think positively. One would think that Ntate Majoro, being an economist, having a global reputation, would want to preserve that and really just try and lead the country, try to create some kind of unity. But you realize that politics don't work that way, particularly our kind of pedestrian African politics, where even him being there means there's 1 or 2 favors owed, and it's about how that unfolds. Like DC coming out of being the opposition and now being a main player in another coalition. The scores to settle, it's not just going to be as easy as we'd like it to think.
Benin held local elections on Sunday despite the coronavirus pandemic. In an effort to protect voters, the Electoral Commission and other partners put hand sanitizers in polling stations, and voters were also obliged to wear face masks. Let's take a look.
This is the Abomoye Kalavi polling station in Benin's capital, Cotonou. Despite the threat posed by the coronavirus in the West African nation, voters have come out to cast their ballots as they seek to exercise their choice in local leaders. To them, COVID-19 is just but one of many problems that they want to be addressed.
I live in Cotonou. Our commune needs a mayor who can fulfill the desires of citizens. We dream of building infrastructure such as markets, roads and many others, so that Cotonou becomes a major player in the sub-region.
What we can expect from our elected representatives is development of Cotonou, our capital. I will still like the problems we have, especially flooding, social problems and development problems, to be a top priority of the elected representatives.
In an effort to minimize the spread of the virus, the Electoral Commission and other partners have put hand sanitizers at strategic points. Voters are also wearing face masks.
I would like to thank the Autonomous National Election Commission, SENA, not to say the government, which did everything possible to ensure that the vote was held without contamination by the coronavirus. The vote this Sunday, May 17th, will not be an open door to the spread of COVID-19.
Up to 5.4 million registered voters cast their ballot. The voter turnout is still considered a little lower than expected. 5 political parties are battling it out as they seek to control over 1,800 municipalities across the country. As the vote counting gets underway, the West African nation awaits the outcome.
Southern Africa's regional bloc urged member states to support Mozambique in fighting militias with suspected links to the Islamic State group in the natural gas-rich north of the country. President Emerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, who chaired a summit including the leaders of Botswana, Zambia and Mozambique, cited a growing risk of religious extremism and radicalization in Southern Africa, threatening peace and security. More recently, the Islamic State group has claimed a number of attacks which security officials have struggled to contain.
The threat of terrorism has, in the past decade, assumed greater proportions. SADC region is equally affected by this growing risk of violent religious extremism, radicalization, and terrorism.
The terrorism you can't fight alone everywhere. This is the experience what we have. We needed to share the forces, not only in region, for Africa, for all way.
The Democratic Republic of Congo gradually restarted economic activities after more than a month of confinement to avoid the spread of novel coronavirus. Citizens showed their approval for the lifting of some of the measures imposed by the government. Among the activities that resumed operations in the country are public transport and hair salons. Both were affected after the freezing of the local economy, but some other businesses, such as bars and restaurants, will remain closed. And on the occasion of Eid al-Fitr, volunteers in Algeria sprayed disinfectant at the Abu Hanifa Enowemane Mosque in Algiers as part of a national campaign to disinfect places of worship. The holiday will be affected this year as nations around the world take measures to curb the pandemic, including outdoor festivals and other events being cancelled. Meanwhile, Algeria will increase curfew hours during the Muslim holiday that marks the end of the holy fasting month of Ramadan. So far, Algeria has reported 7,377 confirmed COVID-19 infections with 561 deaths.
We started disinfecting the mosque because of the epidemic ahead of Eid al-Fitr, in order to avoid catching this disease, and we ask God to get rid of this epidemic.
We're taking one last break. Stay with us. Thank you for joining us again. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas announced on Tuesday that his country withdraws from all agreements with Israel and the United States. During an emergency meeting in Ramallah, the president said the Palestine Liberation Organization and the State of Palestine are absolved, as of today, of all the agreements and understandings with the United States and Israeli governments, as of all the obligations based on these understandings and agreements, including security ones. The announcement comes in response to plans by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to annex Jewish settlements in the West Bank that were outlined in the so-called Deal of the Century, which was proposed by U.S. President Donald Trump.
Israel has to uphold responsibility before the international community as the occupying power in the occupied land of Palestine, with the entire commitments according to Geneva Convention on 1949. We hold the U.S. administration fully responsible for the operation of the Palestinian people, as it is a major partner of the occupation government in all the oppressive decisions and measures against our people.
The first UAE flight to Israel carrying coronavirus aid for Palestinians was seen on the tarmac at Abu Dhabi Airport. The United Arab Emirates flew its first publicly announced flight to Israel on Tuesday, carrying medical aid to Palestinians coping with the pandemic. The company also flew a humanitarian cargo flight between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv. Hungary's parliament has voted to end legal recognition for trans people. The new law defines gender as based on chromosomes at birth, meaning previous provisions whereby trans people could alter their gender and name on official documents will no longer be available. Also, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán passed a bill during the coronavirus pandemic to allow him to rule indefinitely by decree. Trans rights groups say the law violates international human rights norms and goes against the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, as well as previous rulings of the Hungarian Constitutional Court. The British government has announced that the coronavirus death toll has passed 35,000. But according to the Office for National Statistics, the real tally is at least 41,000, with almost 10,000 dead in care homes in England and Wales alone.
248,818 people have tested positive, and that's an increase of 2,412 cases since yesterday. 10,025 people are currently in hospital with the coronavirus. That's down 17% from the 11,716 this time last week. And sadly, of those who've tested positive for coronavirus across all settings, 35,341 have now died. That's an increase of 545 fatalities since yesterday. And of course, our thoughts are with the families of all of those who've lost their lives to this virus.
Online retailing giant Amazon has reopened all of its 6 warehouses in France following a labor dispute over working conditions. Amazon had been locked in a battle with labor unions, which said the multi-billion-dollar company didn't do enough to mitigate contagion risk for staff. In a joint union statement, workers said they and the management had agreed on the conditions for restarting activities, but that their resumption will be gradual and based on voluntary decisions. The precise conditions are due to be worked out at a meeting next week. Teachers and students in Greece have demonstrated against planned school reforms for the second time in less than a week. State school unions demand to postpone planned school reforms and improve health measures at newly reopened classrooms. The proposed reforms would expand the assessment of teachers' performance, start teaching a second language at a younger age, and introduce non-traditional classes that include workshops on how to run a business. Unions also oppose Ministries of Education guidelines to live stream classes to allow students to rotate class attendance, citing privacy concerns.
The first thing we need is dialogue with the Ministry of Education, something it has never done before. This should start now. It is an opportunity with these mobilizations to convince the ministry that dialogue is needed when such big decisions are made concerning schools, teachers, and students.
Millions of people in India and Bangladesh have been evacuated as one of the strongest cyclones in years is expected to hit the region on Wednesday. Cyclone Amphan is expected to pack winds gusting up to 185 kilometers per hour, prompting officials to evacuate more than 2 million people in India and Bangladesh. However, evacuating efforts are being hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Ensuring social distancing and adequate sanitary conditions in shelters has become especially challenging since emergency funds have already dried up.
Making the evacuation COVID-19 safe is another challenge because of the lack of space in the cyclone shelters, limited access to the sanitation and supplies. So what we are doing on the ground is we are preparing the cyclone shelters, cleaning them up. We already cleaned about 10 to 15 cyclone shelters on the coastal Bangladesh, completely disinfected, and then preparing with some additional materials such as making some plastic sheeting so that they can still have separate rooms, and also ensuring the supplies, which includes soaps, hand wash, toilet cleaners, and everything for the communities.
And with that, we end our news brief. But you can find these and more stories on our website, telesurenglish.net. Be sure to also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.